Well, welcome. No? Didn't? Well, that's very nice of you, and I won't take that as license to speak longer than I really should. And so I want to welcome the students, the faculty, the staff, so many in our community who have come to hear our dear friend and colleague, André Churchwell, talk about just everything. He's a polymath. And I want to also recognize, I think some of Andre's patients are here as well. I don't want to have any HIPAA violations, but I do want to say he's a very, very dedicated, outstanding physician and educator, and so welcome to his patients and others in the community. So what do I say about this remarkable man? He is perhaps, there's that beer commercial you've seen, the most interesting man in the world, where he kind of always doing these things, and I'm like, well, you know, every time I meet Andre, there's like something new that he's brilliant at. And, you know, this and that and this and that, and then like, you know, about a month ago, he said, I drew this sketch of you when you were speaking, and I was like, I opened it up, I said, this is my portrait. I've just saved all this money. He's a gifted artist. But let me tell you a little bit about my good friend and my colleague, André Churchwell. I'm very proud to say that he graduated from Vanderbilt Engineering School, and he was a magna cum laude graduate of Vanderbilt. From there, he went to get his MD at Harvard Medical School. I think among great families, important families in Nashville's history, it's hard for me to imagine a family more important than the Churchwell family in shaping Nashville for the better in areas of education, research, journalism, civil rights, and a truly inclusive and diverse community. I'm very pleased that, and I'm sure she's very proud, that Andre's mother, Mary Churchwell, is here. And I know other members of his family, his brother Robert, his sister Marissa, his wife Doretha, daughter Crystal is here. Robert's son Benjamin is also with us. Brothers Keith and Kevin, I know well, both are also doctors, and they practice medicine out of state, and they send their love and their support to us and, of course, their brother Andre's. One of Andre's many awards, you'll hear more about this, is the Trumpet Award for Medicine, which he shares with Kevin and Keith. I know, as I said, his mother, Mary, you should take enormous pride in what this family has accomplished, and you are a model for every parent, and the aspirations for education and for changing the world for the better that we all should have. So Andre then went on to do his internship, his residency, and his fellowship in cardiology at Emory School of Medicine and the affiliated hospitals in Atlanta. Vanderbilt was very fortunate to welcome Andre back into our community in 1991. And everything that Andre has put his mind to, put his heart to, put his soul to, that we have asked him to do, he has done in extraordinary fashion over the last 25 years. And that includes as a professor of medicine, as a professor of radiology and radiological sciences, as a professor of biomedical engineering, as the senior associate dean for diversity affairs, who worked with Jeff and so many others, George Hill, to transform the School of Medicine for the better. Last year, for his achievements in the areas of diversity and inclusion, it was Vanderbilt's great honor to bestow on Andre the inaugural Levi Watkins Jr. MD chair. Levi was a friend and a mentor who was a personal inspiration to Andre's life, as he was for so many, and he was a dear friend and a trustee at Vanderbilt. Andre has more awards. He probably has to build an addition or rent a lot of those storage places for the awards. He racked up the J. Willis Hurst Award for Best Clinical Teacher at Emory, was named Emory University School of Medicine Resident Alumni Distinguished Achievement Award recipient. For the past 10 years, he has been named one of our nation's top cardiologists in the best doctors in America. He's also recognized as one of the nation's 15 most influential African-American educators by Best Doctors in America, by Black Health Magazine. He is a passionate contributor to the Vanderbilt School of Engineering's alumni mentoring program, and he invests his time into fostering meaningful relationships with bright young students. I was coming out of my regular cardiology appointments. I think they're worried, or maybe they're hoping I'm going to fall over on the job, and I ran into André, and we started talking about a student that I had as a freshman, and André was already mentoring this young individual who's now up at Harvard Medical School, and counts André as one of the most influential people in his life. At our School of Engineering, he's been recognized for his leadership, his talent, and his service with the Distinguished Alumnus Award in 2010. Earlier this year, he was elected by his peers to the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering College of Fellows in recognition of his outstanding contributions in teaching, research, and innovation, specifically the interface of clinical cardiology and biomedical engineering for patients, and as a mentor for trainees, educators, and young investigators. For 2 consecutive years, the Vanderbilt University Organization of Black Graduate and Professional Students honored him with the organization's first Distinguished Faculty Awards. Patients, colleagues, faculty, staff, students alike are drawn to André. I know I am, for his special gifts, many gifts that he has developed so beautifully to build a beloved community. Gifts in medicine to promote healing and wellness. From 2010 to 2013, he was awarded the Professional Research Consultants 5-Star Excellence Awards, which places him in the top 10% nationally for medical specialty services and overall qualities. So that's pretty good, right? Well, he was invited to participate in the Rhode Island School of Design Museum exhibition. So let's just get this all right. Professor of Engineering, Professor of Radiology, Professor of Cardiology, Levi Watkins Professor, esteemed educator, clinician, and now he's at RISD. I don't know. In 2012, this brings great pleasure to me, Raymond Berry, the former wide receiver for the Baltimore Colts and former New England Patriots coach, whom I saw catching passes from Johnny Unitas as a youngster, wore an André Churchwell designed tie as he presented the Vince Lombardi Trophy in the Super Bowl. I think it's fair to say that André might be the most, I'm stepping out here, André, the most fashion-forward cardiologist in America. Maybe, if not the world. What is he going to share with us this evening? What is he going to share with us this evening? Just so many things he could share with us, but a sliver of the breadth and depth of his talents and skills. Tonight, André will share with us the role of art in its relationship to applied physics and, of course, modern medicine. We are in for a truly enlightening evening as our good friend and colleague André Churchwell explains how a dual mind can lead to new ideas in art and science and results in finding solutions to complex medical challenges. After his talk, he'll be taking some questions from the audience, and if you'd like to ask a question, we'll point you to those microphones. But let me turn this over to our very distinguished Chancellor's lecturer, our good friend, André Churchwell. André?
All right, man. Thanks. Oh, boy, that's great. Wow, I was wondering who was he talking about. You just kept going on and on there. That's great. Well, welcome, friends. And I can say that in a real sense. We're pleased that all these great friends have come to this evening to listen to me give this talk. What I'd like to begin with is that the talk is a talk that I give to the Senior Biomedical Engineering Senior Design class. I've been doing that for the last maybe 4 or 5 years. And that course has been arranged, put together, and done so beautifully by Associate Professor of Practice there in the Engineering School, Dr. Matthew Walker. And Matthew, are you here? Raise your hand, please. Because Matthew's the one that put here he is back there. Matthew put that lecture and that design class together, and it's through his work that I've actually, thank you. Please let him know that. And his design students have won national awards based on some of the work he's done. But he has me come out to give kind of the introductory lecture, which is around the area of creativity and applied physics. And I try to help the students know that there's great value in using the metaphoric idea of the right brain being around art and humanities and the left brain being around science and mathematics and kind of determinism, that it's important to try to meld those and blend those. And there's certainly ways to do it, ways to let the guards down so there is this cross-pollination that leads to a more learned eye, that you can see things better as a scientist, as a physician. So we're going to talk about that. That'll be the thrust of the talk. I'm going to break it into some components. One component will be about creativity, where that idea comes from. And believe me, that's an endless subject. Usually when I give a talk, I talk about a cardiology topic like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. I can get my arms entirely around the year's literature on that one. In creativity, it is infinite. I've been through things, and it's amazing how the writing goes on, and you could well imagine the number of models that exist for that. And then we're going to talk about some specific models that I've used in the class to talk about it. I'm very much around biographies and kind of individuals, learning from individuals. Though you can learn from groups too, but I'll talk about one person who I don't know, but I've read a lot about, Leonardo Da Vinci, one of our tremendous right-left brain people, where the merging of art and science was an important part of his life and career. And then I'm going to talk about somebody who I met on a couple of occasions, but knew his sons very well, and that's Arthur Guyton of University of Mississippi, the late Arthur Guyton, who was probably, I think, the first modern biomedical engineer in America, in my mind, modern in the sense of post-World War II. And then lastly, we're going to talk about a great mentor and friend, the late Tom Mcmann, who passed away at age 53 at an early time. I met Tom during my time at Harvard Med School when I spent about 6 months of my senior year working on cardiovascular research, but little did I know that I'd stepped into the land of Mcmann, and I'll share you what that land was all about and what it led me to learn. But I think one thing my wife made it clear to me is I need to begin by giving you a little backstory. Why am I interested in creativity? Well, you got some of the answers out in the lobby, and some of it are on the screen here with Francis Sinatra and the Bruce Banner turning into the Hulk. So there is this interest in mine that I have around art and illustration. Not at the level of a Shane Neal, but still someplace in that ballpark. Shane's out there. So there is a backstory. And the backstory, as in many cases, begins at home with mom and dad. And my father, as you know, was a great journalist, the first African-American to write on a newspaper in the South. Well, little do you know, and probably very few know, that Dad actually did artwork. And he did it as a teenager and in high school at Pearl. And drew figures for me as a young child when I was about 4, 5, and 6. And that stimulated me, obviously, your dad does something, you want to do it, to start learning how to draw. And so started doing comic book characters originally. I think our family must have kept the neighborhood pharmacy going, because we probably bought about 3,000 or 4,000 comic books from that drugstore. And they're down in my basement if my brothers ever want to know where they are. And so from that, I learned how to draw. And from the comic book art, I specifically focus on the work of Jack Kirby. You all probably know Kirby as those of us that are really being barraged by the Marvel Universe now being on the film. When I was a kid, there was no movies, but it was the art. Jack Kirby created these Marvel characters, the Iron Man, the Hulk, the Thor. The idea of the character, the drawing of the character, the uniform, what they were about, sprung out of this genius mind. Jack Kirby's real name was Jacob Krutzenberg. He was an Eastern European Jew that landed here with his family in New York City and had this amazing gift from the Lord. But as many of the Jews did at that time, he had to change his name to work on Madison Avenue as an artist for Timely Comics. So he changed his name to Jack Kirby. And similarly, his writing friend, Stanley Liba, changed his name to Stan Lee. And so those guys created the Marvel Universe and this amazing growth of interest in comic book art. And so I studied Kirby a lot. And so these are some of the things that sprung from my study of Kirby. The drawing on the left, or painting on the left, is the dark racer, or black racer he drew in one of his series called The New Gods. And I did that probably in 1971. And that's oil on paper. And I preserved it. The other one is the more recent drawing, and it's my idea about super lunch. Superman being eaten by this monster here. So you can see Superman is flying in an unknowing way that he's about ready to be gobbled up by this creature. So those are things that come from my work, thinking about art, learning about action art, about, contrapposto, we learn in your fine arts class is the sense of movement. Well, no one could create movement like Jack Kirby. I hate to tell you, Leonardo. And so I learned a lot about that from him. And then the illustrations I began picking up on my own, just teaching myself, getting the books off the coffee table that Mom and Dad would buy about the unknown Leonardo's drawings. And I took those in my room and just practice and practice. And I started developing a way to do hatch art, this kind of thing I did here in St. Patrick's back in, I think, October of this past year. That's the St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. I was standing across the street in New York City being barraged by people while they were watching this crazy guy sketching there. There was a lot of comments about craziness, and I understand that the psych hospital has a van out in the back, so please protect me as I go forward here. And then Sinatra Centennial, I put the blue eyes on him. And then I did a lot of work around studies. So there are leg studies, arm studies, and then I did a lot of work on hands. Hands are the most difficult thing to draw or sketch or paint, as Shane will tell you. So I did a lot of work. As you can tell, I'm a lefty, because that's my right hand I'm drawing, because I'm drawing with my left hand. So those are things that I had learned from, but then as I got older, that eye of the drawer or illustrator becomes the eye of a designer. In Italy, there's the same word used for designer and engineer. I don't know if you know that. I'll show the word here a little bit later. So there's a very short stop from illustrations and thinking of body design and structure to clothing design and structure. So when my father used to take my brother Bobby knows about this, every Sunday and sit us down before we go to church and tell us, this is how you have to put yourself together. You start this way, this matches this tie, that coordination's wrong. And so he fired my imagination again as I got older, started reading about illustration and design and clothing design as a way to think about clothing on a human form as a form of mobile art, a la Alexander Calder. So I began thinking of doing clothing, designing my own clothing. And so with the luck of someone who's a little bit on the crazy side and calling people in New York, I was able to connect with a great friend, Bruce Boyer, the senior design writer for men's fashion design in this country, who connected me with people at Ralph Lauren, tailors at Turnbull and Asser, and these people all become great friends and my great postgraduate mentors. So I've done a lot of things in art and clothing design to the extent that a small group of people in New York got to know about it. So I started showing up, not in the New England Journal, but on the money page of the USA Today. In the fall issue, I was asked to discuss the coming fall line in 1994 for men's clothing. I doubt, Nick, you're going to find many chaired professors on the cover of USA Today talking about men's clothing. Subsequent to that, Ruth LaFleur, who's this amazingly gifted writer, the style writer for the New York Times, called me in about 1999 and so, André, I want to ask you about the fall line of men's clothing coming out in 1999. And so this is when the movie came out with Pierce Brosnan, the Thomas Crown Affair. So I discussed that in the context of a new suit. And once again, you know, the guys in the white coats bypassed me again. And so I was able to talk about that and get that in the New York Times. And then in recent years, my contacts have led me to be asked by Kate Irvin at the Rhode Island School of Art and Design to contribute some of my designs, my clothing, to an exhibition on men's clothing in the 20th century. Once again, I think, Nick, we need to get more of our professors tied into this kind of thing, don't you think? So here's the suit. It's a Prince of Wales check, and I won't go into great detail because that'll be another hour, but there's only one true Prince of Wales check, and Shane knows that. And that fabric was made by an Irish company called W. Bill Textile, and so it's about a 14-ounce suit that doesn't need me to be in it for it to stand up in the corner. And so Kate Irwin had heard about this suit, and so I sent it to Kate with one of my Turnbull shirts and tie, and she put me next to the Duke of Windsor's tartan suit from about 1928. So here's the Duke. He's about 5'4". Those guys were short, and here's young André about 6'3" without a head on. So I can say, as I speak my last words on my bed, my suit was next to this loud suit by the Duke of Windsor in the Rhode Island School of Art and Design. Well, in subsequent years, fast forward, the people in Esquire have been tracking me, and they had me contribute to this past fall's issue on 50 men looking their best in the 50 states. The problem is these guys don't look good, but that's another story. There's only one or two of us that look halfway decent, but that, once again, we could get into details. I don't know where they found this gentleman, but that's another story. But my imagination gets fired for different reasons. Around the time that Prince William and Sarah married, it was apparent, well, it was a beautiful wedding. I'm sitting there with my family looking at it, and I was struck by the amount of lace that was present in Sarah's wedding dress. I said, that's curious. I wonder if I can do something like that. Bing. So I sit down with my drawing pad down in my man cave that my wife has created, with my drawing board, and I sketch out a dress in satin and lace, front, back, sides, just the patterns, look up how you do a pattern, then go to the textile fabric store down on 8th Avenue and buy the fabric, and then my poor lovely wife of 34 years allows me to use her as a model, and I then design, and we take the fabric to a lovely Vietnamese tailor in Brentwood, and after maybe 6 or 8 fittings, voila. And this is the swan ball dress she wore in about, I think it's 2013. It was one of the 4 featured dresses, gowns, that the mavens were running around taking pictures of and spotlighting in the In Focus magazine. Our problem was when they kept running up to us and said, where did you find that dress, young lady? Who made that? We didn't know what to say. Everybody else is saying Oscar de la Renta. They're saying, St. John, and I said, we could say André Churchwell, but they don't know who he is, and also they'll probably think once again to send the paddy wagon after me, because they wouldn't believe I would have designed this and had this made. So there you go. So this is what you're in for, a guy who is not really in the box. The walls have come down, and he does a lot of free associating. We're going to talk about that creative process. I'm going to begin by quoting my great mentor, Tom Mcmann. Tom was an amazing scientist, biomedical engineer, and we'll get to that work, but he was what we call a loopy thinker. He could go back and forth, a dual-minded thinker. He could go back from literature, which he would write, fictional literature, that he won major book awards for, back to the lab. And I found out this later in my time with him, but we'll get to that. But I pulled this, his wife Carol and I talked about this a few weeks ago, and she said, you ought to read this, because this tells really where Tom's head is. This is from Tom's book, Ira Foxglove, and it's about one of these scientific, fictitious 19th, 18th century scientists he made up who had an invention. And so he was a famous scientist, and the public asked, well, where do these things come from? And Foxglove says, as far as I can tell, ideas always show up like that, absolutely free, and very often in a nearly final form. What you do have to do is test them with your education or with your experience to see whether they're any good. You can go to school or grow old learning how to test ideas. That takes hard work, but no one can teach you how to get them. They come from nothing. And that's a great idea. You like that, didn't you? And so, but Tom felt, as many people feel about ideas, some come from nothing, but actually a lot of ideas, as we've come to learn in the 21st century, do come from a lot of invested work and knowledge. And we'll talk about that idea, but that's fascinating, and this is part of our talk. Beginning with creativity, it didn't show up into the dictionaries, oddly enough, until the early 60s. That's an odd thing, but I went back and researched this. My source on this is Dr. Keith Sawyer, who is a PhD in cognitive psychology at WashU, and this is a great book. If you want to learn about this, I would please spend your time reading Sawyer's book. And Sawyer, oddly enough, he's got that dual-minded thing going too. He's a tenured professor at WashU in cognitive psychology, and creativity is his field of research. But on Friday and Saturday nights, he's in the jazz clubs in St. Louis playing hot jazz. Okay, that's what he does. And so there's this, once again, this blending. But, look at create comes from the Indo-European root cur, to grow, and Latin creatio or creatus, to make or grow. So to grow ideas, to develop ideas. And from Sawyer's point of view, as he reviewed the world's literature for his book, there are a couple of ways to think about creativity. It is a new mental combination expressed in the world. It could be something totally new, or it could be a combination of 2 known ideas leading to something new. So think about that a little bit. So it can be a spontaneous idea, something new, or it can be a combination of things that exist. Most of the little C's he talks about from individuals they're engaged in are things that we do every day. When you modify a recipe, when you get lost driving to work, you come up with another idea, another route that comes to mind. And he makes the point that there are some big things that occur from individuals, such as Einstein, or the guy or lady, as he expressed, who discovered or created fire. But in many cases, we do a lot of little C's all day long as we try to figure out things through the course of the day, and there are spontaneous little acts of creation. Then there's the socio-cultural definition, which is more about a group activity. such as Silicon Valley guys in an empty room bouncing a baseball coming with ideas about a new program, such as the Manhattan Project coming in Los Alamos, coming up with the atomic bomb. And those oftentimes do lead to big C, big discoveries, but not all the time. But those are generally done as a socio-cultural event by a group. Creativity, though, if you look back, and I've been digging through it, there are many ways to think about where it comes from. There are those that look at, it's definitely the realm of the soloist. I mean, it's Miles Davis, man, okay? Or it's the group. It's not Miles, but it's Miles and Coltrane and McCoy, Tyner together, creating something as a group unique and different that they couldn't do individually. Or it comes maybe, if you're thinking in more ancient times, as an epiphany or placed in your head by the muses, or come to you in dreams, which there is something to be gained by dreaming, I might add, to put ideas in your head. There are a whole host of things. Imitation can be a form, despite Oscar Wilde's admonition about imitation. It can be with modifications. I would say some of the things in the lobby out there are maybe subtle forms of creativity when I mimic or modify Jack Kirby a little bit. And they spring from a lot of things. They even feel that the societal creativity around a legal system is a social activity that modifies over the years. You have to create a legal system. You have to then adjust it and modify it over time, and that is a form or type of creativity. And then there's some interesting things that occurred in the 1960s, which I won't get into, where creativity is now being brought out by these exogenous agents such as LSD and so forth, or Aldous Huxley and his Doors of Perception even a few decades before, using things to stimulate his mind. But one thing I want to make the point about, and the autism concept, a little bit of autism is a good thing, because what it leads to is less filtering and more things in reaching consciousness to be processed. And that's what Leary and these guys were kind of depending upon, using these things to open their doors of perception, to allow less filtering and more things to reach the cognitive level to be processed. But I will say there is a rationalist creativity. When my dad sat down every morning to write a newspaper column, he had to write on a deadline. Okay, and he had to create on that deadline. And that's what we do, that's what writers do, good writers do every day. And it is a creative process, but it's on a deadline. And I want to share another type of deadline or a market-driven type of creativity in a minute here. Lastly, I want to mention that it's interesting when you go back and look at the crafts and art, we're going to talk about Leonardo in a minute, that if you look at pre-Renaissance, most art was considered a craft. It really wasn't considered an artistic or creative venture. You were just told the Pope wanted a picture or you wanted this statue, and that was it. You went to the school of Verrocchio or that group, and they made something. And it wasn't until the High Renaissance when it became really appreciated about the appreciation of the body as a unique thing to be studied, that there became a clear understanding or appreciation that the work of Raphael and Michelangelo and Titian and Leonardo and these guys was truly a major creative act, to the extent that these guys became rock stars of their times and became millionaires. They were rich, as reflected in the recent Michelangelo exhibition here at the Frisk. His family, the Bronte family, from the mansion that he left the family in Florence and saved many of his drawings, donated those drawings to go across the country. And so he left a lot of fortune and a lot of wealth. Unfortunately, Leonardo did. I think to be wealthy back in these days, you had to stay connected to the Pope and to the church to be constantly used. Leonardo was not very religious, and he moved around, and we'll talk about that. So another form of crafts was chamber music, the great chamber music written in the 17th, 18th century. It was just made to be background music while the royals had fun and dinner upstairs. It's kind of like you playing the Pandora box upstairs, or when you have friends coming over. It wasn't until later that it became recognized that these were clearly creative, artistic, gigantic things that were being done. So there's always a tension between creativity and innovation. And so when I'm talking to my med students, I show these slides, and I want them to realize that recognize that there is value in the idea and the product. But you'll find a lot of innovation research or discussions around the fact that if it's just an idea and it doesn't lead to something that humanity can use, is of no value. I disagree with that. I think Tom is talking about that in his Ira Foxglove piece. When it's hard to come up with great ideas. He always would tell us in the lab, I can find a lot of guys that do differential equations, but I want some ideas to come out of this lab, okay? So I would argue that. And also there's that tension between the arts and science that I want to try to minimize or mitigate, that there is worth in jazz, the creativity of jazz. And there's new worth for Mark Glazer to use a new catheter to go up someone's leg, hopefully doing the right thing. Go here. Moving to kind of working design and creativity on a schedule. I was fortunate about 10 years ago through my friends in New York and New York men's design and worked to meet the Purple Label designer at Ralph Lauren and the whole host of people that work for Ralph Lauren and his design team. And so Doretha, poor woman as she is, would follow me into the 650 Madison Avenue headquarters of Ralph Lauren's team to go and listen to talks about, I would love to hear how they created. And so one thing that they would do when they would have a meeting with Ralph about the new line coming up for spring for men, and this was probably 2001, his idea would be, I want something around Paris. I want it 1920s. I want you to think about the clothing and what the women would wear. And so go out and put it together. So they would go out to New Jersey, and Ralph Lauren has bought tons of things from estate sales from America and Europe, and he houses this in these warehouses, and these are the things he uses to populate his stores. But he would bring these, John Vazone, my buddy who worked for Purple Label, would go out there and bring in these white creation rooms, these large, maybe 200 feet by 100 feet white rooms with a lot of boards on the wall that they would then have artists start drawing a scene in a cafe in the 1920s, and it right on the wall, Paris 1930 theme, dressing the mannequins up in these amazing pieces of material, of these clothing that Lauren had kept in hermetically sealed, just like Johnny Carson, rooms in these warehouses where the temperature was controlled. Mannequins, hundreds of mannequins dressed in estate clothing from the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And he would have them bring them in and dress the mannequins up, and then they would walk around and ideate. So John and his team would walk around and say, maybe we need to kind of tweak this collar. Maybe the collar should be shorter in 2001. Maybe not so wide. Maybe the jacket should be a half-inch longer. Literally like engineering with the tapes, measuring tapes. And by the end of that work period, they would have come up with the season line for that spring and began working on the fall based on what Ralph's idea of the fall should be about. So this is working on a deadline, and it's another form of creation in design. And it's interesting that the word for designer and engineer in Italian is the same, il geopartista. It's the same word. So the designer and creators should be viewed in that way. And Ralph would tell us, I don't design clothes, I design dreams. Well, it's his dreams, but they are fired and fueled by, once again, a little bit of mimicry, a little bit of imitation, but taking something different and then modifying it, two different combinations we're talking about, to make something new. Shakespeare on creativity told us in the Midsummer's Night Dream, the poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to from earth to heaven, as imagination bodies forth. The form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and name. And this is probably for me, the lunatic, there you go, the lover, the poet, are of imagination all compact, all together, all placed together. So I think that's the way you need to think about is when I talk to my students about trying to bridge the ideas of innovation, about creativity and arts and music, use that to then think about how you do science. The thing with engineering education that we've had to come through in the last decade or so is the recognition that engineers can't really ideate or be very spontaneous because they would make mistakes when they designed this desk or they designed this bottle or designed the plane. They can't be playing jazz out there when they're building a new Boeing 747. Well, the point is, it's not in the actual formation and structure of the plane they're playing the jazz. We've had to come to realize it is in the ideation. It's in the problem creation. It's in the problem finding, and then using all those other ideas that the artist and the artist's eye can bring to then inform our ideas as to what we should build. So we've had to work with getting our friends in engineering and my engineering colleagues and all of us to recognize that it is clearly the precision, and Tom will talk about that, of making something proper, but it does require opening up your mind and the other vistas there. What happened to bring creativity back on the stage here was a seminal talk given in 1950 by J.P. Guilford. And you would say, creativity, really? One talk did it? Well, that's kind of the inflection point there. Because up to that time, B.F. Skinner was still, the mainstream in terms of psychology, teaching, and training, as was the Pavlovian dog still running around, and Freud's couch. And so so for J.P. Guilford to come to the American Psychological Association as the new president, and the plenary address is about creativity as the new direction of the American Psychology Association, that was heretical. But it was really timely, because behind him were a bunch of guys like him who had been working for the federal government during World War II. in working with the OSS to try to find those few good American James Bond type guys to be secret agents who could be, you could certainly do it, you could measure some of that with intelligence, but there are a lot of other things around creativity, thinking on the spot, that Guilford and his colleagues began to realize was not something that necessarily was inherent in an IQ test. And so this is what brought Guilford back to the point of bringing creativity to the attention of the researchers, to start studying it, to bring the cognitive people in. And it turns out, after this talk, there was a wave of institutes across the country, around the country at major college institutions around creativity, and Guilford had one too. And so that was the beginning of really putting creativity as something to be studied, tested, evaluated, and appreciated as an entity to study. For models of learning about this, if you go back in time, it was The Apprentice. You were in Verrocchio's studio if you were Leonardo. You were dropped in there by your dad at age 14, and you learned the craft. There were no classes per se. You learned by doing, by watching the master. And eventually, as things evolved, we started having schools, and eventually Masters of Fine Arts and PhDs in Fine Arts evolved. But there's still some value in this apprenticeship concept that still exists, I think, in schools. And we move to the models now. We're going to spend just a little bit on each one of these. I'm going to start with Leonardo da Vinci. Now, when I started studying for this, I'd already been doing a lot of work on my own for years, looking up and reading about Leonardo da Vinci. And I think I will say that Da Vinci's life and studying Da Vinci is one of those endless pits. It is one of those endless areas. You can never get enough, learn enough, know enough about Da Vinci. Bill Gates, in about 1994, bought 11 of Da Vinci's notebooks, paid $30 million for 11 pages of Da Vinci's notebook. And there are 7,000 volumes. This guy had the original ADD to the 9th power. I mean, constant writing and thinking. And Michael Geld, who maybe one day we need to bring here, is at the University of Virginia, has spent most of his entire life around studying Leonardo, walking in his footsteps in all the places he lived, was born, and then going through and finding all these manuscripts and reviewing the volumes and coming up with some sense about genius. If you read his notebooks, and boy, you have to be able to read that backward mirror writing, he is very informative. He is sharing his thoughts moment to moment. I mean, there's tons of things he talks about, ranging from how to think, how to hear, how to listen, that are embedded in this book and are embedded in his writings. And one of the things I'll talk about is that we're very keen about using devices to try to amplify our senses, so these phones and so forth. Well, I would say there's something about what the monks are all about, and probably even before Da Vinci, learning how to listen very carefully, how to smell, taste. I'll give you one clue on being able to see better. Da Vinci mentioned being able to enhance your ability to see, to really see, to observe detail. Go into a room on a Saturday in your home where there's an open window there, dark room, natural light, sit, take off your shoes, let the floor, or if it's cement or carpet, get a full sense of what that feels like into your feet. Kind of absorb that feeling. And then as you sit there, close your eyes and cup your hands over your eyes. Okay, this is in natural light, no lights in the room. It's light outside. And look at a vista of trees, not homes or kids playing. And then study it initially, and then cover your eyes, and then take a couple of deep breaths, and then wait, and then bring your hands down, and then slowly open your eyes. And what you're going to find is you're going to start seeing things you never saw when you first looked. And there are things that you see, like the color of leaves, they're different than what you initially thought they were. Or there was actually a bird on that twig. Or there's something there in the cloud that I didn't see before. It looks like a man's face. Now, once again, don't call the guys in the white coats yet, but I would say if you practice that, and I've been practicing that for a while, it will begin to enhance your ability to see more. And there are other ways to do it about hearing, so-called layered hearing and active listening. I won't go into detail on that now, but these are ways to amplify what the Lord has given you in a way that it enriches your life daily, and you learn and see more. And this is embedded in this book and in his writings. So this guy was an inventor, and painter, a sculptor, mentor, scientist, anatomist, urban planner, athlete. One thing about Da Vinci, is this mic working here? It is working, is it? Good. One thing about Da Vinci that I began learning is that he was Florence's best horseman in his youth. He was also the strongest man in Florence. I begin to think this guy's from Krypton because apparently to humor the children, they would bring him horseshoes and he would bend them straight in his hand and bend them back. He learned how to play multiple instruments, flute, lute, and so forth, and made his own instruments, sang in court, phenomenal voice apparently. So this guy was really, took advantage of all these things about his observational skills that he had. When Gale pulled through his manuscripts in these notebooks, there were a couple of things, about 7 things he felt fell out that are Da Vincian principles, and I would suggest you think about this. Curiosity. Sir Kenneth Clark, the curator for the British Art Museum, who wrote the great book Civilization in the BBC documentary, said Leonardo was the most curious man in the history of the world because he constantly kept a notebook and constantly was taking notes to himself, notes about what he saw, drawing faces on the street, looking at colors he had not seen before, insatiable, unrelenting quest for new knowledge. As a matter of fact, on his deathbed in the arms of the King of France in 1519, he is still reciting what it feels like to die to his secretary. He is quoting and waiting for them to write these things down. Kind of amazing. Demonstration, a commitment to test knowledge through experience, persistence and a willingness to learn from mistakes. Is that what we're trying to teach our students, medical students, engineering students? Senses, the continual refinement of your taste and senses, especially sight. I talked about that before. Sfumato, meaning in smoke. That was the concept of the layering of the paint with his finger on the Mona Lisa's face. It took 4 years for him to finally finish the Mona Lisa. 4 years. And the face, the flesh looks like, the paint on the face looks like real flesh. It's amazing when you go up and look at that, apparently. And he did it by individual finger painting on the skin. But along with that up in smoke, there is this idea of being able to embrace ambiguity, embrace paradox and uncertainty. That's what you learn from, embrace it. And then the context of art and science. He said many times, you need to learn the art of science and the science of art. So that's what we're talking about for our engineering students and our medical students. And the whole thing about whole brain thinking, which is blending the creativity both from the art side as well as the science side, and corporalita, the body, a cultivation of grace, ambidextrity, finesse, and poise. Very important. He actually was a lefty, which I was glad to hear, thank goodness, because I'm a lefty. But he learned to write with both hands. He taught himself how to write with his right hand, which came in very useful because he had a stroke about a couple of years before he passed that took away the use of his left hand, so he could continue writing. And this whole thing about mirror writing, you've seen that before. He writes backwards, and there's about 3 or 4 theories about that. Some said he was trying to confuse you so you wouldn't be able to know what he was doing. The other thing is that it's easier, and actually it is easier for a left-handed person to write backwards like that. And the third thing, which is apparently the truth, because Vasari, Giorgio Vasari, who wrote The Lives of the Artists in, I think, 1540s, asked Leonardo about it, and it was about, he wrote mostly with pen and ink, and so if you write that way, you won't mess up the writing. If you write left to right, you would get ink and smear the writing. So if you want to ask you that in one of these home games about trivia, then you have the answer there. And then the other thing is connecting, the sense of connecting, the interconnectedness of all things in nature to the body and the science. And one of the things that was interesting about that is that's kind of what the Vitruvian Man idea was all about there, that there were some fundamental things that Vitruvius, the Roman architect, thought were fundamentally related to the body's proportions, that the span of a person is equal to his height. And there are a number of other generalities that work out of geometric proportions that led to this Vitruvian Man concept. But it is this sense of connectedness of the body and using those proportions to build buildings. As an architect, he used those universalities about body proportion to construct the Roman temples and buildings and Senate buildings. Interesting. So that's what we get from Leonardo, and I could go on, but I could go on, but I'm not going to go on. But a few other things here. That's the blending of the art and the science. So he could draw like he was a draftsman to the highest power, amazing draftsman. But he was very keen about the science of this, that objects in the distance need to be less distinct and they need to be smaller. And so he created a grid on all of his drawings to make certain that the perspective was absolutely correct. And he would really caution his students that this is what they had to do. And this was a lot more laborious, obviously, than just standing there just drawing. And this is one of those doodle maps or mind maps or thought maps I was talking about. So, you think you doodle and you're just kind of messing around with, look at this. So this is what Bill Gates bought. I hope you can understand it. And so this was kind of what he would, thousands of sheets. In the course of a day, he would put his thoughts down of what he was encountering or what he was thinking about doing next or whatever. Here's a building design. I could make some of this out. He was designing a home or a room for someone, and he showed what he was going to place in there. Some of this is he's thinking about playing his flute up here somewhere. And then there's all kind of things about things he's going to build or design. And it's just free associating. He really felt this curiosity was insatiable, the idea of putting things down and writing them down. He was very keen about notebook keeping. He wrote everything down that he saw and observed, and these mind maps. And I think one of the things that I learned from this is that we all need to use drawing, though people say I can't draw, but you can draw. If you practice enough, there's certain books that teach you. But even though it doesn't look like what's out in the lobby or what Shane Neal or Jack Kirby can do, you understand what it is. And so using drawing is a way of taking another part of your brain and using it to connect with something, to think about it in a way that you would not have otherwise. So your drawing can still help you imagine and reflect on problems if you do that, even though I can't tell what the heck you got on the paper, but you can tell. And so there's great value in learning how to draw, even if it's your own type of drawing. And that was an important thing. He was, once again, he wasn't connected to the church like Michelangelo with Pope Julius and the tombs and all that. So he didn't make as much money, but he was running around to Florence and Milan based on who had the most money or who would give him an interesting job. And so he would, the Duke of Milan was involved in battles, and so he would he'd write this beautiful letter of introduction that he was an artist and he could do things in terms of making great pageants for people's marriages, which he did. He did a lot of pageant planning, amazing enough, marriage planning, wedding planning. But he also designed weapons, and he would do that, and he would also design things that he was interested in, kind of an early helicopter. And so I'm going to end with that on Leonardo. I could go on, but I'm going to now move on to Arthur Guyton, who I think is the most modern, he's the modern biomedical engineer. Guyton was born in Oxford, Mississippi in 1919, oddly enough the same year of Jackie Robinson and Nat King Cole. And they were in the South, so I think Montgomery, Alabama for Nat Cole and Cairo, Georgia for Jackie Robinson. And I met Dr. Guyton once at Harvard Med School when he gave a lecture about his unified theory of hypertension control, this amazing diagram that he had put together, this block diagram, control system diagram. And then I got to know Robert Guyton, one of his 10 children, who was chief of cardiac surgery at Emory, really well. I spent a lot of time querying Robert while we were in the operating room about his father. But he had three-dimensional visual intelligence, probably very much like Leonardo. He could see it in his head before he would make it. And so he could see the finished product. So he built sailboats. When he was a kid, they brought him a Erector set when he was 3 years old, and he could build amazing things. And he was, in his teenage years, he was already designing and building sailboats. And by the time he's in high school and college, he is building motorized cars. And he told his parents, you know what, I could be the carpenter, the appliance repair person. I'll take the money you're going to give anybody to come fix anything. I will take that on. And he learned how to take apart everything and put it back together. Stoves, refrigerators, everything, and he learned from that. He built the first electronic pressure manometer when he was at Harvard Med School, and he designed and built the first electric wheelchair. Didn't take money, didn't believe in making money on devices that help people. He never got a patent, and he was given a presidential citation. The first motorized joystick wheelchair was designed and built by Arthur Guyton, given away to a company. He developed polio when he was in training as a surgeon, and so had to go back and leave his training at the Mass General to go back to Oxford, Mississippi, where he built this giant physiology department from his sheer will and genius, and he created an electric horse. He designed a horse in his home, in his business, to pick him up. He gave the patent away to a company for that. It was amazing. He designed in his home a concrete home. He thought one way to prevent fires and tornadoes from tearing your house, make your house out of concrete. So his house was 127 feet long, and he had to locomote in a wheelchair now. 17 rooms with, I think the halls were like 30, 40 feet wide. And he put a 2-inch pool of water on the top of the house each summer to cool the house. And so this is one of these, once again, loopy thinking guys. And it's a great book called Inventing Art. His childhood friends could not pronounce Arthur properly or art, so they came up with Art down there in Mississippi. and that's what he was called by his close friends and his family the rest of his life. And so his postdoctoral students wrote this book. I recommend you get it. A little small book about inventing art, the legacy of Arthur Guyton. And one of his sayings was, adversity plus imagination equals discovery. And so he built a sailboat from scratch, and in Oxford, Mississippi, his next-door neighbor loved to sail on a sailboat, and his next-door neighbor was William Faulkner. And so Faulkner and Ott would go out and sail on his sailboats that he would make, and fly in Faulkner's planes, and they almost died in a plane crash, as a matter of fact. They were able to, thank God, no one was injured. And so when he got married, moved back to Mississippi to start the physiology department, he started having kids. He had 10 children, all went to University of Mississippi, and 10 finished Harvard Med School. And I think one of the children, the daughter, actually trained here at Vanderbilt in medicine. But one of the rules in the house, like Guyton was, you have to make it yourself. So here are 6 Guyton kids in an electric motor car, which they built themselves under his supervision. He supervised, he didn't build it. And I was informed by Robert when he was 10 years old, his father brought him into the laundry room. You can imagine, have a huge laundry room with kids that. And the washing machine wasn't working. He said, Robert, here's the toolbox, fix it. So I'll be back in 6 hours. So he walked out, and Robert said, well, he gave him the specs. So he took it apart and was in there sweating bullets and found that the belt had snapped. That's what he could tell was physically wrong with it. So Dr. Guyton came back in and said, okay, what do you think's wrong? Well, I think the belt is snapped, Dad. So they went to the hardware store, bought a belt, and he said, okay, put it back together. So he put it back together, and he said, well, it worked, Andre, but there were about 10 bolts that I didn't know where they were supposed to go, but it worked for the next 10 years. And so that was the rule of thumb in the Guyton house. There were no electricians, they did electricity in the house, they put their own electrical wiring in their home, plumbing, and you can imagine what that was in terms of creating and molding people to think out of the box on their own. So 2 of his sons are cardiac surgeons. You can imagine how that allows them to think in moments of crisis, how they can then imagine and think in a creative way. And this is his block diagram. We'll have a test on this at the end of the lecture. The unifying theory of hypertension control, when there's a kidney block diagram, there's a cart in there. Actually, Jeff Balzer knows this by heart. I may ask Jeff to come up and talk about it. But this was what he spent his life doing. This was his life's work, and it was an amazing piece. This was another, and so you have in Guyton 3-dimensional visual intelligence, and a clear sense of I don't mind being wrong, or I don't mind not knowing the answer. I'm going to figure it out. I can be wrong. There's going to be a lot of paradoxes and ironies that I'm going to be dealing with, but I'm going to figure it out, and I just keep working at it. I get the best people. I study it. And so this is kind of the lesson of Dr. Guyton. I think truly the first biomedical engineer. Built this electric wheelchair. There's that joystick. That's one of the ones they made. And then we're going to move to my last model, and that's Tom Mcmann. When I was a senior at Harvard Med School, I needed to do a project, and I spent about 6 months working in his lab. Someone told me, I want to be a cardiologist. You want to learn some about left ventricular dynamics, cardiodynamics, particularly in diastole. Then you need to go find Tom Mcmann, who was working with Bill Gash, who was at Tufts at the time. So I trekked over to Cambridge, and I walked up to the applied physics building and went in, and there was a guy sitting in the desk, looked like a grad student, bouncing a ball off the wall, catching in his glove with a dog sitting on the side. I said, I'm trying to find Dr. Mcmann. He said, I'm Dr. Mcmann. And so that's where I met Tom. And Tom is a true oscillating thinker, a double life, a double thinker, a divided mind. His mother was a writer, and that's where he probably got his writing interest from. And when he was getting his PhD in aeronautical engineering at MIT, he was able to bargain with his PhD committee to allow him to take a creative writing course at Harvard University that you had to apply for to be accepted in. He got turned down a few times, and he finally was accepted in. And he valued this writing as much as the science. He, in some interviews I've been able to read recently and talking to Carol, his lovely wife, who I've kept in touch with, Tom really was very kind of divided, but he was a very shy man. You didn't know much about all this other stuff was going on. He didn't want his colleagues to know in engineering he was writing these novels, and I'll talk about the novels in a minute. He said, well, they won't believe in that, and they don't think that's serious stuff. You know, engineers, they measure stuff. They get things down to price. I'm out here kind of making it up on the fly, Andre. But he said there was one central tenet that was common between the the scientific research and the writing, and that was the originality part, the creativity part. So that's where the union came, coming up with these original ideas, both for his projects and a lot of things that you're going to see me talk about. His writing and his loopy thinking about humanities informs some of the research. So here we go. Hey, hold on to your seat here. So Tom, when he finished his PhD, when he finished his first novel came out to wide acclaim. It was called, interesting title, Principles of American Nuclear Chemistry. You'd think that's a book about nuclear physics and how you design bombs. No, it's about a fictitious group of scientists working on the Manhattan Project out in Los Alamos and about the bohemian life that they lived, particularly at night. And so that's what that book was about. And then the next book that came out was a book called Mckay's Bees. And this book was written, Tom became, within the history of Harvard, one of the youngest tenured professors in the history of Harvard. I think Tom and William James, within 6 or 7 years on the faculty. And he received the Gordon Mckay Professorship in Applied Physics and Biology. First time they ever done that. Mckay was some 20th century industrialist, lived in Boston, gave this money. Well, I don't think I would have to do this, but this is Tom's loopy thinking. He made a fictitious character called Gordon Mckay and wrote a book about him. And Gordon Mckay is this inventor in the 19th century who lives in Boston, who wants to move to Kansas to create a new city built on the product of industrious bees and the honey that bees create. And so the story is about Gordon Mckay going across country on a steamboat, and the people that populate this steamboat are very colorful folks. He includes real people that he then writes stories, builds them in. William Seward is in the book, is in the chapters. He then, when he lands in New Orleans, decides he wants to create a moat when he gets to this town in Nevada that they're building a fanciful hotel for Gordon Mckay to live in. He wants to put a moat and put alligators, so he gets 2 alligators called Adam and Eve that he brings with him to populate the moat. Let me read the first sentence in here of the book, of this chapter, and I will give you a sense where Tom's mind is. Gordon Mckay based his plan for a new city in the West on bees because of their energy. One never finds them disappointed or confused. They have their plans and they have their hopes and they love their work. In the morning, from the moment the sun touches the hives and warms them, the bees come forward and jump into the air. They are agricultural animals, like chickens and pigs, but the difference is in their energy. There is, of course, the possibility for failure in anything. Nectar flowers must have the wet and the heat in some reasonable proportion or they will give up. But the bees never let themselves fall into reveries of worry and speculation on their fortune. Instead, they conduct their affairs with confidence and optimism. That's the opening segment. So you're grabbed and you'll read the book. And so Tom spent his sabbatical year in Vermont learning about bees. And so that was the basis of using the bees in the book. Another book it wrote was Loving Little Egypt that kind of was prescient because this book came out in the 80s, and this was about, I don't know where he gets these ideas from, a little blind child called Little Egypt, who, this is in the 19-teens, had figured out how to have multiple conversations ongoing on the phone line with other blind, brilliant kids like him, tying up the entire telephone system of the United States. And so Little Egypt realized this, that this could lead to devastating effects on the United States. So the book is about him traveling across the country, trying to find Edison, trying to find Alexander Graham Bell to fix this. And so this Little Egypt was the first hacker, okay? The first hacker on the phone lines. And so Tom, where this comes from, his wife told me, and one of the things I tell the students, you need to find your creative space. There is a creative space and time for everybody. Mine is in the shower, about 10 o'clock at night. And so Aretha's built a shower that's got a seat in it, a writing board. No, she didn't do that. But she's built a new shower, and our water bill is pretty high because for something about the ideas come. And when I have the kids raise their hand or who gets their ideas in the shower, there's usually a number of people that do. How about out in this audience? Who gets their ideas in the shower? Look at that. See? There's something about that warm, nurturing time. It's quiet. I think it creates a sense of flow. Flow just happens maybe in the course of that environment. Some people get it running. Who gets their ideas running in the morning? Okay, there you go. Yeah, there's something about that flow that the neuroscientists say that you're generating a set of connections where you're most active in coming up with ideas and being most productive. And oftentimes when you're in this flow, you lose sense of time when you're doing that, and you're extraordinarily productive. and hopefully that's what happened out in the hall there for me. So that's something to keep in mind. Find your creative space and time. You may be a morning person for your creativity or an evening person, but it is something you can study about yourself and learn. The last book is Our Fox Love, and it's a kind of a crazy book too. It's a 19th century scientist who actually, his wife leaves him, Portia leaves him. She loves swimming underwater, and the book opens with her slamming her scuba gear in another suitcase and swimming out of the house. And the book is about him searching for her across America in a blimp that is driven by a great friend of his named Neptune, who's a blimp pilot, and they're traversing the country, seeing the world, and encountering, once again, scientists and these fictitious characters. So Tom was, Carol said we'd never bothered him. He'd get up about 4 in the morning, go down into his study. He had a writing chair that he would sit in with his pad and book there. No one would bother. He'd be there from about 4 o'clock to about 6:30. Then he would emerge, hand her the papers, and take off, get on his bike and drive into work. And we never heard about this at all when we were with him. One way we got a sense about Tom's loopy thinking, and I'll get to this, how he informs science with his humor, is that we were involved in a project of looking at LV diastolic function. We had to know the filling pressure of the left ventricle at any time and moment as we fill the heart to measure the pressure in it. And we tried a number of techniques. We tried to tie off all the outlets of the heart, fill the heart up, and measure the pressure, but the water, the saline leaked out because you have thespian veins and coronary sinuses. So we started using different balloons to put in there. And they all were too stiff. They had, their compliance or stiffness was worse than the left ventricle, stiffer. So we were fumbling, and Tom said, have you all thought about using condoms? And we said, well, we hadn't thought about that. We tested the condoms, and their compliance was much, much lower than the left ventricle, so it was the perfect thing to use to fill the heart up and measure the pressure. And he said, okay, Andre, here's the money from the drawer. You go down every Monday and buy 100 condoms down the street here at the corner of Leslie College and Mass Ave. That's this old Italian pharmacy that's been there for years. And so I'd go down there every Monday, and I'd buy 100 condoms and come back. And we'd do the research, and they would bust, and we'd have to go back. Every Monday, pull the money out of the drawer. And after about the 3rd month of this, I went in there, and this old Italian guy, maybe he was first or second Italian, no, you can't come in. You can't come in. Something wrong with you. Something wrong with you. Wrong. I said, I'm doing science. Oh, I know you're science. You're not doing the science. And I had not noticed that his daughters, his teenage daughters, had always come to the front of the store when I was going in buying these condoms. And it finally dawned on me, they're standing there going, yeah, like this. And I said, wow, no, I'm doing science, but down here at Harvard. Oh, no, I know you students, No, don't ever come back in here. I'm going to call the police. So I went back to the lab, crestfallen, and sat down in the group with Tom and said, Tom, can't get any more of the condoms. Tom looked up with that smile. I'm sure you saw his smile. Pulled a map out of his drawer. He'd already had it in there. He knew it was going to happen. Andre, here's a map of Boston, Cambridge, and he had already circled pharmacies. You go here this week, go here this week. Go to Cambridge, go to Newton Square here, go to Kenmore Square here, you go. So for the rest of the, so research part, didn't have any problems with but that was the kind of thinker he was. So he was interested in a lot of things, walking, running, heart function. But one thing was running, and running on tracks. I'm going to end with that in a minute here. But to know about tracks and trying to build a better track for the poor, dismal Harvard track team that had horrible times, the president came to him and said, you need to build a track so our times can improve. But Tom said, the other times are going to improve from the other runners. He said, I don't care, our times are dismal. So he gave Tom a grant, and he went out to study running. He had never studied running before, or walking. So he studied running in typical Tom fashion. He read everything, A.V. Hill's research. And he came up then with his usual thing, great observations, Andre. Simple observations then lead to simple solutions. He believed like Einstein. He didn't play with the life of man with dice. He believed that simple explanations, simple experiments could be the basis of kind of understanding complex things. He was a genius at that. So he was looking at the fact that if you run on a surface and you're trying to get from this point to this point in the quickest way, there are a couple of things you want to do. You want to make certain that when your heel strikes the ground, that you don't spend too much time going down, in a spring fashion down, but you spend more time stride length going that way. So you want to have a surface that's almost like cement or something, in that you have very little heel strike time, but you need something like a trampoline then to go from this stride length to a longer stride length, some intermediate type of material. And so he began studying running, and he realized that as he watched his runners and he measured the stiffness of the track to the stiffness of the body, they had to be matched. That if you had a track that was less stiff, then the body's vertical stiffness went down too. So there was less force being transmitted to the head, as a matter of fact, when you run, when the track was less stiff. But you could also modulate that vertical stiffness by bending your knees and running. And so as he had guys doing all kind of running, it popped into sentence, Groucho running. So that's where the idea of Groucho running. And this was in the Journal of Applied Physiology. He found that you could reduce the case stiffness, the vertical stiffness of the body, and therefore reduce that impact loading, but at a higher cost of oxygen consumption. You could well imagine running like that, you use more oxygen. But he wrote the paper, and it was accepted, and Groucho running was accepted, and was an article in the Chicago Tribune, and the letter of the editor said, did the students run with stogies and flip their eyes up and down and roll their eyes when they ran? But Tom didn't answer that particular question. So that was one of the things he did. Then he took the idea of the tracks. He really spent a lot of time on the tracks, and he actually came up with an intermediate Young's modulus. Now Jeff will know what that means, but it's looking at the different stiffness parameters for different types of material. He calculated what the stiffness needed to be to allow you to have the least contact time with your heel and to get more potential energy given back to you like a spring so that your stride length was best. It was something intermediate between cement and a trampoline, and he found it out by going to the CRC tables and coming up with something. And that was his paper, and that was his genius. So he's showing this poor Harvard guy, he's showing running on a really stiff track, showing that the heel contact time was good, but stride length wasn't the greatest. But look, on a springy track that gives you back the potential energy of the spring, your stride length is best on a trampoline. So that was the basis. Simple thought, simple observation. If you came to his lab with a lot of equations, he didn't want to hear it. You had to come with the ideas first. And so they published the Harvard numbers, and he was so proud of it, but we all said, these are great numbers for them, they're improved, but they're still lousy numbers. But they're Harvard numbers, okay. And then the last thing, before he passed, he saw a nature special, Nova special, on the Jesus lizard that could run across the water. He said, wouldn't it be cool to be able to run across the water? And so he began studying it. He got a grant and went down to South America and got a bunch of these, brought a graduate student, of course, with him, and they came back, and once again, high-resolution films to study the running. First, no equations, observations first. What did you see with high-resolution films? And strobe lights in the lab. These lizards were running all around the lab. We were in there trying to do our cardiac experiments. And the lab was a large open room with each corner was where the different experiments were going on. They weren't separate. So we were seeing what everybody else was doing, and the lizards were running around while we were trying to do our heart experiments. And so what he found was that the lizard basically creates an air pocket that he can stand on for a few milliseconds. So Jeff, he can bring his knee up this high, and he can slam his foot down, webbed foot, wide foot, at such a velocity that he pushes it down. He creates a vacuum, an open vacuum, around the edge of his foot. And air runs around here, catching the drag forces, the frictional forces of the water here. There becomes a vertical moment here, if you do the XY. I'm not going to get into this, but there is for Newton's law, for every action is a reaction. So as he slams it down, the simple thing is there's an equal force coming back up that will support that lizard for a few milliseconds. And and I guess those that made it through Darwin's selection can get their foot out and get their other foot down before the pocket closes. And that's what he determined. He also then calculated what it would take for him to do it, and it would shatter the human femur. And we can't generate that kind of force. But he was very much into this allometry, the study of design in nature. You know, the similarities between what body shapes and sizes make it through evolution and what body shapes and sizes don't. And this was part of his whole concept of that. And he did this about tree design. And he found very simply about trees that the trees that made it through hurricanes or winds had a certain fundamental relation between the trunk of the tree and the width of the limb and the length of each limb. That if those that were built properly and followed a particular geometric relationship, when the wind would hit them, they would hit the resonant frequency of the tree and would just oscillate rather than having too much damping or underdamping and fracture. And those are the trees in the forest that live. And that was his work in that. And these are all, and there's a NOVA experiment, there's a NOVA show of him with he and his wife in the White Mountains with them pulling on trees. You can see them out doing that. And so that's Tom. As we move to the current, there's a couple of papers in the New England Journal of Medicine that talk from Karen Welby about that art-science collaboration, that it is the building and merging the observational skills between art and science that can help us do better in understanding medical problems and solving problems. that cross-pollination does create new radical ideas, and that there are a number of things going on in America right now and across the world that are blending the science and the artists. What we're doing here at Vanderbilt, the Engineering Life Sciences building that is going up now, will be that type of blending of artists, scientists, engineers, bringing together their different looks, but merging that into one common eye and vision to solve mankind's problems. I hope you all have enjoyed this the rambling musings of an engineer and artist and scientist. So thank you all for coming. I'll take a few questions here if we have some questions here. And I think it's some microphones here if we got a little time here. I may have exhausted everybody. What do you say? Oh, thank you. Max.
Hi, Dr. Churchwell.
Hey, Max.
I have a question. You probably know this. Pretty fascinated with your mitigated interest in a bunch of different things. And being that, obviously, being a cardiologist has taken you a whole lot of time in your career. At what point exactly did you decide, or did you find the time and ability to get so invested in fashion? Because that's a big interest of mine. And I'm headed to medical school, and I'm like, there's no way I'm ever gonna be a designer.
Max is one of my mentees. I met Max at Georgia Tech. He's a Howard College graduate in engineering, and he was at Georgia Tech, and I met him and said, you need to come up and work with Dave Merriman here to do bioengineering of aortic valves. And so he left Georgia Tech, and we found him some research, and that's what he's doing. He's just gotten to medical school, though, so congratulations, John.
Thank you.
Yeah, you know, one of the things I've learned, that flow thing is important, but the thing is, I've found that is a recent phenomenon is to be able to hyper-focus. So you got to be able to kind of be able to hyper-focus when you're in an area. So in the area of whatever it is. So if it's in the area of men's design, I have like a library you can imagine. I gave a talk here a few days ago to some friends of mine about men's fashion. And so that is the basis. I still study. I think one thing about those lists about creativity, I do believe strongly that I think there is some things that are dropped in from the man above, but most creativity is a result of a lot of work. It's that whole thing about 10,000 hours, 10 years of work to become an expert. It does take building a database of experience. Malcolm Gladwell and others have said it, but it was even said before him. 10 years of work, calculating up how many hours per day you would work would be about 10,000 hours to become an expert. And it's only by having that particular experiential and database that you actually have the data upon which to draw to come up with these ideas. Yeah. Somebody else behind you there.
Hi there.
Hey.
So thank you again for your talk. I mean, it was really inspirational and really awesome. So my name is Jeremy, and I'm a senior undergraduate here at Vanderbilt. So right now, I'm about to graduate, and I'm looking around for jobs. And, I've always sort of been an aspiring Renaissance person myself. I always have found lots of different disciplines really fascinating. And so now I'm struggling to pick just one thing to stick with for a job. And to make things a little bit more complicated, it seems like employers really love specialists as opposed to people that like lots of different kinds of stuff. So I guess my question would be, what would you say to someone like me who is an aspiring Renaissance man, but is feeling the need to also feed himself with a paying job?
Well, I think that's the answer. That's a great question. You can see I'm still feeding myself, and so so you have to have an area of specialty as your basis. So mine is cardiology. Yours could be engineering. It could be graphics. But that's a platform from which you can then expand. But you have to begin with the basics of having. It's the job that allows me then the time and the resources to do the other things. It's not the other way around. I think that's what sometimes young people can get a little bit turned around in the process. You do have to have some level of expertise or a job, and then you're able to expand. Don't let the other interests atrophy. You keep those, you germinate those. I spent 5-6 years in building my research career before I even came back to Vanderbilt at Emory, Georgia Tech, working with aeronautical the chair of aerospace engineering at Georgia Tech, Don Guyton. So I spent a long time delving back into the mathematics and solutions for coronary artery fluid mechanics. So I had to get back in and learn that stuff. But then I had to become a cardiologist. I had to finally, decide what it is I want to do. Another question.
In the context of the combination of art and science, would you comment on the current controversy surrounding the idea of the flat earth.
The idea of what? Flat?
The flat earth.
Okay, all right. Now, you mean flat in the sense of Tom Friedman? The world is flat because of all the information technology and the social media?
No, literally flat versus being
Well, you're going to have to, we'll have to have a conversation after this one then. So you and I, Magellan and Columbus, going to have to sit down and talk about that one.
I asked it in the context, it's breaking the net, as they say. It's
Got it. Well, Friedman certainly made it clear that it is flat for other reasons in terms of knowledge expansion and transfer. But thanks, man. Anybody, one more question? I think we'll take one more. Yeah.
Hi, I'm working on a project. I'm an engineering major, and I'm working on a project comparing engineering graphics with French art, like Picasso or Cézanne. And I was wondering, how do you hone creativity in STEM classes? Because I'm trying to compare or trying to implement art into STEM classes, but how do you hone creativity in an artistic way with STEM majors?
Right, well, that's great. And that's going to be the beauty of the engineering, the new life sciences building, because we'll have innovation classes that will be specifically created around blending, exactly what you're talking about. There's a great article, one of the articles here, the Carolyn Wellberry article. There's a picture of a sculpture, a wire sculpture of the brain and the spinal cord, beautiful, that was created by the combination of a neuroanatomist, neurologist, and a expressive artist, wire artist. And so there will be an opportunity, I think, in those hybrid type classes and moments where we have the idea to put those things together that'll teach us and help us learn different ways to look at things. I think right now in STEM, you have to have, hopefully you're in a class where Matthew Walker is leading the class and he'll be open to those kind of thoughts.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. All right, I appreciate you all for coming. I hope that was